just how dependent we've become in our daily lives on this stuff. How many of you, truthfully? Okay, I know you can. I know I can, because I'm old. But the rest of you, how many of you, if I gave you an address somewhere in Puerto Rico, right, and I gave you a paper map, how many of you could find that place? Drive there. Not anything else, right? Yeah, okay. That's how dependent we are, right? So think about how dependent we are on that one information system, right? That navigation system. Think about one of the big things that we've been wrestling with post-pandemic is supply chain interruptions. Think about what supply chains would look like if that whole system, which directs trucks and truck drivers to their scheduled pickups and drop-offs, was out, right? That's a very real possibility. So, all right, so we're online here. Great. So the end of my improvisation, back to my regularly scheduled programming. So that's just one example. So let me try to break this down a little bit and think about some particular separate things when we talk about cybersecurity, because we have this tendency to sort of throw it into one bucket, right? Well, let's separate them out a little bit, because I think that's important to understand. One thing, when you talk about information systems, you're really talking about things that control stuff in physical space, right? That's a big part of information systems. Navigation, for example. Energy flows, right? Do pipelines work or not work? And so you can have intrusions through cybersecurity means that have very real physical effects. So let me give you an example of that. One you may have heard of a few years back was called the Stuxnet virus. I don't know if that rings a bell. This was, depending on who you want to believe, a American intelligence operation combined with Israel and Germany at some level. And the target was Iran's nuclear fuel production facilities. Why? Well, because if you want to make nuclear weapons, right, you need a particular isotope, right? You need uranium-238. It doesn't just exist in nature. You got to create it. You've got to spin all this raw uranium around really fast. And then that particular molecular weight comes out and you're able to sort of extract that. So you need very precise, very fast centrifuges, which Germany makes and the Siemens Corporation makes and had sold to Iran. So this virus that's introduced into that system, into the control system, like I said, German, Israeli, American intelligence operation, nobody really wants to claim entire credit for it, but some combination of those. Put this virus in that made those centrifuges turn at slightly the wrong speed and vibrate a little bit and break down, right? So with a computer virus, you're able to cause physical damage to high-tech equipment that delayed Iran's ability to get the kind of uranium that is needed for making weapons. So that's one good example. Another way that you can think about this, that's sort of intrusions that affects things physically, the Colonial Pipeline hack, right? Maybe you remember this, maybe you don't. Just a couple of years ago, I think 2021, somebody got into the control systems of this pipeline network that supplies fuel oil to much of the mid-Atlantic part of the United States, Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, that region. Suddenly, those areas were critically short of fuel oil, right? So whole other systems could not run. Now, this was done by a hacking group, a criminal group that was trying to extort ransom from the pipeline owners, which they did successfully, right? So it's an information system intrusion with physical consequences. But then you've also got things that perhaps are a little bit more psychological, right, rather than physical. things that are designed to weaken people's confidence in systems. If you wake up this morning and you check your bank account and you think you've got, I don't know, $1,000 in your bank account, and you look at it and you find out that, oh my God, you've got zero, right? You're going to be frantic, right? And then you check 15 minutes later, right? And you got $50,000. You think, woohoo, I'm rich, right? Let's go buy a car. And then you check an hour later and it's back to 1,000. I'm betting that most of you would go to the bank that afternoon and see how much of that money you can get out of it in cash, because you're not going to trust that system, right? Do you know what percentage of their total assets banks carry in actual cash that they can give to their customers? Very, very small. So if you create a situation where thousands of people want their money from a bank, that bank's in big trouble, right? So you can do this to create weakened confidence in systems, whether it's banking, electoral systems, right? I don't even necessarily need to get in to change votes. I merely need to be able to demonstrate that I'm able to penetrate the system at some level, voter registration or something like that. And people are going to stop having confidence in the whole electoral process, right? So this is very much sort of psychological. And then if you want to think about it in almost sort of a military sense, right? You can think about it as sort of a type of military operation designed to, what you might say, prepare the battle space. In military terms, when they talk about preparing the battle space, what they usually mean in ground warfare is, launching lots of artillery attacks before you move forward. But cyber systems and information systems provide ways to do that through computers, right? So before Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, it got into government information systems, and it used malware to wipe off a huge amount of information that made it really difficult for government agencies in Ukraine to coordinate and communicate, right? So it was a good way of preparing the battle space, increasing confusion in your adversary before you even launch a military attack. So you got all that. And I think that's what most people tend to focus on when they think about cybersecurity, and it's all very important. I really kind of want to focus more on the last part, which I think is really interesting. But another thing, of course, to think about in terms of cybersecurity is espionage, right? Okay, arguably the world's second oldest profession. This is nothing new, right? States have been spying on each other for as long as there have been states, actually even before that. What is different today is the ability of states to vacuum up huge amounts of information, right? And filter it and store it and correlate it and figure out how to use it in different ways. So the United States does this with its allies very, very broadly, right? The US has huge listening stations that are scanning all sorts of digital information flows around the world. They're not listening to it specifically, right? If you go back to the sort of revelations that came from, I'm blanking on the guy's name, the one who defected to Russia. It'll come to me. They're not listening to all these conversations. What they are doing is filtering all this information for particular voice prints of individuals that may be dangerous. They're looking for combinations of words and phrases in different languages that might indicate problems in the future. So the US does this, France does it, Britain, the US with its combination of various allies through the Five Eyes program does it. And the People's Republic of China does it in a big way as well, right? So in that case, though, what China's been doing is usually a much more direct way in of gathering information. Let me ask you a question. Has anybody heard of the Office of Personnel Management? You shouldn't. There's absolutely no reason why you would. So of all the incredibly boring bureaucratic entities in the US federal government, this is by far the most boring, right? You would never think about it as a big target for espionage, right? You think, oh, the CIA, right? The NSA, that's where the secrets are. The Office of Personnel Management, though, keeps all the personnel records of government employees. So when I was a government employee, I had a top secret, secure, compartmentalized intelligence clearance. So, reasonably high level. So do lots of other people. Office of Personnel Management has all those records, all the questionnaires you filled out, all the details about your life, everything that goes into getting a security clearance. And so I got a letter one day, a few years back, saying, dear Mr. Selden, we regret to inform you that our systems were broken into and your information, along with thousands and thousands of other people's, was taken. Now, we know that was an operation by the People's Republic of China, which means that somewhere in an office, in the Ministry of State Security in Beijing, there's my file, right? Along with lots of other people. And you can see how, not every day, but if you go through these things carefully, you're going to find individuals and their potential pressure points and secrets that they have that maybe they don't want to have let out, and find ways that maybe you can get people to work for you at different times. So what's happened, espionage is very, very old, but what information technology gives you is an ability to do this on a massive scale that simply wasn't possible before, and do it in a way that doesn't necessarily trigger a response, right? So picture this, right? Let's say it's pick your date, 1965, right? And China wants to do an operation like this. They want to get the top secret clearance information on thousands of people that are stored in a building in Washington, D.C. What would they do? Well, you probably have to get, a very large van, drive it up to the wall of the Office of Personnel Management, blow a large hole in it, physically take filing cabinets, stick it into the back of the van, and drive off. Now, that would be an act of war, right? But this, how do you respond to this, right? And that I think raises the critical questions that we're going to get to, which is response is a much trickier thing when it's done through these more electronic means rather than physical means. And last, I want to get to this, what I think is a really important area, and often neglected in all of this, is what we sometimes call information operations. What do I mean by that? Well, you can talk about information operations in terms of military affairs. They refer to as psychological operations or psyops. And there you're trying to persuade troops on the other side to lay down their weapons, and surrender and things like that. That's one thing. We can think about propaganda, right? Using distorting materials, changing factual materials in such a manner that it's designed to get a particular reaction from people. In a softer way, we can think about what we like to call public diplomacy, which is really about trying to persuade other publics, foreign publics, to think differently, perhaps more like us on particular situations. So what's the difference? It's really sort of the degree to which one is packaging and manipulating information, right? And how far you're really sort of stretching things from reality, I would guess. But all of this is about manipulating information and doing so to get a particular political reaction. Once again, none of that is new. What is new today is that we have massive tools, very impressive tools for distributing this stuff very rapidly to massive audiences in ways that are very difficult to shut down. So that changes things from previous periods in history and puts us in a very different kind of time loop if you think about it. All right. So with that, let me focus on a couple of other things that make this very, very different and distinct. I put up a couple of pictures here, sort of the banking system, the rail network in the United States and Mexico, the electrical power grid. That kind of gets to the second bullet point that I want to raise here. When you talk about critical infrastructure, the stuff that we need to get through daily life, whether it's banking, transportation, power generation, all these things that affect everything else, most of that, in fact, almost none of it is actually under government control, right? It may be in other countries, but not in the United States. So that means that because most of it's in the private sector, your real challenge is working out cooperation between the private sector and government to come up with some kind of more holistic package of defense and response. That is actually really, really difficult to do. Because for the most part, right, people in the private sector aren't eager to reveal big vulnerabilities in their systems, right? And they're oftentimes not eager to reveal when things have been broken into because they're afraid of the potential impact on shareholder value, on stock price, right, on reliability. So there's an awful lot of secrecy that goes on in this world and prevents kind of the transparency and information sharing that might make a more holistic response possible. Another critical issue, and that's the first point here, it's not always clear who has attacked you. So when I talked about the Colonial Pipeline hack, yeah, that was a bunch of criminals operating somewhere in Eastern Europe, we weren't sure exactly where, who were putting this software into the system that was shutting down that pipeline and demanding money in return. But here's the thing, there are plenty of times when we know the Russian government has used groups just like that to do their bidding, right? Because one could certainly see where some of these attacks would be very useful to Russia at different times, right? And so sometimes they use those criminal networks as sort of a way to have plausible deniability, to say, wasn't us, it was not the Russian state that did this, it was some criminal network and we're trying to find it, right? But you can't blame us. So the fact that states can use these non-state actors and give them some plausible deniability, even if you suspect that there's a state behind it, it's very difficult to act, right? And then there's the question, well, what should you do? What's appropriate? I don't know if anybody here has taken sort of the more sort of philosophical classes on, international relations and what do we mean by just war and, justice in war. I mean, you're getting back to some very old philosophical questions, but a big issue is always proportionality, right? It's seen that when you are attacked, you have a right to a proportional response, but not going beyond that. Well, what's the appropriate and proportional response? If you know, for example, that Russia has attacked your information systems and caused these problems to your electrical grid, for example, what's the appropriate response? Do you launch an attack on their electrical grid? Is that the appropriate response? At what point do we say, to hell with this? What you did was damaging, right? You created problems that blocked out an entire city and caused, hospitals to shut down and death. That's an attack. We're going to take military action against you. Where's that line? When do you cross it? Right? Those are questions that the people are trying to wrestle with, and they're not clear. There are not clear answers. Some people have speculated that maybe what we should be doing is thinking about the fact that everybody is vulnerable to this. Russia's vulnerable, China's vulnerable, the US is vulnerable. So maybe we should be thinking like nuclear deterrence, right? We have had nuclear weapons for a very long time, and with the exception of twice in 1945, they have not been used, right? Why? Because of deterrence, because we're all vulnerable. So maybe that's the model. Maybe that's where we need to be thinking. And then finally, another big question, should we be thinking about developing this, particularly the United States and its European partners, as a means of offensive weapons, right? Not just defending our systems, but really using this stuff as another way of achieving goals in international relations, short of actually going to war, right? Should this be another sort of stepping stone in that escalation of hostilities between states? A very debated point. So I raise all those questions because we can get to them later, but they're ones that I think we need to put out front first. So let me talk a little bit about Russia and China as two states that are particularly involved in information operations. I want to focus on them because in the transatlantic context, these two states have had the largest effects, both on Europe and in the United States. But they do things in a little bit different ways, right? And so it's kind of important, I think, to break that down a little bit. So Russia has worked for a very long time and with great sophistication on information systems attacks, trying to hack into systems, whether it is electrical grid or other things like that, as well as information operations. And in fact, the whole idea of information operations, what Russians refer to as disinformatia, this goes back. I mean, this is a critical part of how the Soviet Union operated, right? And what the KGB used to do. They're very, very good at this. But things have changed because of the technology and how it is used today. The other thing that's really important to consider is that, like I said, Russia is very good about having capabilities to launch information systems attacks, but disguise them behind criminal networks, right? So they allow certain criminal networks to operate as long as they do things which advance the interests of the state and give them a certain level of plausible deniability when things happen. It's a little bit different in China. Okay? So in China, you've had a lot more focus, like I said, on information systems and on espionage. But the interesting thing is that they have not tried to hide this behind criminal networks. Chinese government has been very forthright. They have created a very significant and very good capacity in their military. I mean, it is a designated military specialization. There's a cyber warfare corps in the Chinese military that does this kind of work, and they are very, very sophisticated. So they have no interest in sort of hiding what they are doing. They see it, in fact, as an important part of their national strategy. So when you read Chinese strategic documents and they're thinking about this, their point of view is to say, hey, we may be at a conventional weapons disadvantage with the United States in many ways, but their advantage, the U.S. advantage, is heavily based on information technology. Right? And so if we can undermine that, if we can attack that, it's like the Americans' Achilles heel. Right? And so we should focus on that. It's part of what they and others refer to as asymmetric warfare, right? We don't need to build as many aircraft carriers as the Americans have if we can find ways to disrupt the information systems that enable their targeting systems or their communication systems. If we can weaken those things, everything else will start to fall apart. So that's been part of what they've been doing. Like I said, it's much more overt in many ways than what Russia has been doing. They do work in information operations, but interestingly enough, heavily through American and European corporations as part of granting access to those companies in China. So a couple of examples here. Excuse me. There's something called the 9-dash line. This is, God, unless you study like security in the South China Sea, this is totally obscure to you. But if you look at a map of the South China Sea, you know, there's Vietnam and there's Malaysia and the Philippines and there's China up here. All those countries under international law have control over parts of that. And then there's a little bit of international water between it. China says no. China says, no, this is our lake. We control all this. And they have this 9-dash line on Chinese maps that basically goes to the beaches of Vietnam and Malaysia and the Philippines and says, this is all Chinese waters. Nobody else recognizes it, right? And there's been international court decisions about this saying, no, this is not a real thing. Doesn't matter. China insists on it. And here's the thing. If you ever have an American movie that you want to show in China or a European movie or anything, right? And there's any kind of globe or map or picture of the world somehow in it, Chinese government will ensure that that 9-dash line is on it, right? To make sure that international audiences are always seeing that and always thinking, oh, well, I guess that's where the borders of China really are. You know, another good example, why did we call what has happened over the last few years COVID and not Wuhan, right? You got Zika, Marburg, Lyme disease. Conventionally, right, we classify and we label diseases, major diseases, by the places that they were discovered or first erupted. You know, Ebola, right? The Ebola River. This time, no, right? It starts that way and then it shifts. Well, why does it shift? It shifts because of a concerted operation by the Chinese government putting pressure primarily on American media corporations, which own their news divisions in the United States, to change that and say, no, you're going to call it COVID, not Wuhan. We want to create this sort of conceptual space between these things. So it may be more subtle, right? But it is definitely something that China has certainly worked on. All right, let me talk a little bit about Russian information operations, because in some ways they're really kind of interesting and build on previous efforts. And they're very relevant in this transatlantic context, right? So this is something that's been going on, like I said, for a very, very long time. And Russia's efforts to do this, going back into the Soviet days, is you sort of take a plausible story and, you know, a nugget of truth, a grain of truth, and you kind of extend it out. And I'll sort of dig into a couple of these. But, you know, a classic one is the sort of disinformation campaign that was done around the 1980s over this thing called the neutron bomb. What was this thing? So in the late 1970s, the United States started to introduce a weapon into Europe, which was designed to produce blasts, very intense blasts of radiation, but over a very relatively short distance. And the whole point is that, you know, what NATO was worried about is a massive number of Soviet tanks coming across the West German border in a mass. You drop one of those on it, you're probably going to kill all the tank crews and stop that thing dead. Well, this was framed, however, through Soviet sources, you know, working through Western partners, you know, some people quite well-meaning, to say, no, what this bomb is designed to do is be dropped on cities, destroy the life and the people in the cities, but leave the property intact so that it could be reoccupied, right? It was sort of the ultimate, you know, capitalist imperialist weapon. So that wasn't the reality, but that's how they were able to sell it. And it was enabled to gin up enough protests in parts of Europe that it did become a real issue. You know, another one that's going on right now that you will sometimes hear in Western media, and this is the United States is funding biological weapons labs in Ukraine, right? Well, that's interesting. Is that actually happening? No. But as I will get to in just a minute, there's sort of, let me see if I got it here. There is a sort of nugget of truth there, right, around which you can construct this whole story. Some other ones that have been going on recently that are kind of important to sort of stress, and we'll talk a bit about these. One that Russia tried quite successfully in 2016 to do was to plant a false story in Germany designed to really ratchet up anti-immigrant sentiment. So at this point in time, there's a lot of migration coming from the Middle East into Germany. This is stirring up some resentment and some tensions in Germany. Russia saw an opportunity to really exacerbate that, make it worse, which weakens Germany, right? And distracts Germany. They tried a similar kind of story in Lithuania. Lithuania at that point in time was hosting German forces there as part of a NATO reassurance initiative. So they were putting NATO forces from other countries, the US, Germany, Britain, into those kind of exposed smaller countries right next to Russia. So Germany was in Lithuania, and Russian media started to produce these stories about a sexual assault case against a young Lithuanian girl by German forces. That was put in Russian language media, but guess what? There's a distinct Russian ethnic minority in Lithuania that read that and believed it, and it took quite a while for the Lithuanian government to shut that down and say, no, this didn't actually happen. But meanwhile, you start to generate this kind of tension, right? Or in a sort of more angle more towards boosting or solidifying Russia's gas dominance in Europe, they really went after trying to support and promote the idea that drilling for gas in Europe was going to be highly environmentally dangerous in Europe. And yes, they took the obvious problems that can result from this and they magnified it dramatically and channeled that through existing environmental organizations. But in doing so, the end result was to create a situation where those states were more dependent on Russian natural gas rather than having their own. And this was, part of a larger program. Or, this last one here, this is so obviously badly done, right? I mean, no American would have written this, right? I mean, it almost reads with a Russian accent, right? Nobody would say in the God blessed Texas. That just doesn't make any sense. But by putting out these obviously, ridiculous sort of ads out there on Facebook and other social media, you create a sense that whoever is elected is tainted, that somehow foreign hands are out there trying to manipulate things one way or another, right? And that's really the goal, not necessarily to get any one person elected, but to make people start to question the legitimacy of the system. And so all this stuff, it's like spraying water at a brick wall, right? No one drop is actually going to make any difference, but you keep doing it. You keep doing it over time, and pretty soon that brick wall starts to get little holes in it. It starts to weaken, right? And so this is kind of the idea, I think, behind these sort of flood of information operations. So what's all this have in common? Well, if you're going to do a good information operation, there should always be some little core of truth, right? So let me tell you what the truth is. The core of this is, yes, since the 1990s, in fact, 30 years practically, the United States has been funding biological research labs that work on pathogens in Ukraine, right? And this goes back to a program that after the end of the Soviet Union, we wanted to employ scientists and keep them in place because we thought, hey, these people who know a lot about stuff like building nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons. Why don't we try to employ them doing, defensive research and working on vaccines and stuff like that, rather than finding employment with, say, Iran, right? So this was part of that effort. So it doesn't take a lot because you can verify that that is true. It doesn't take a lot to leap from that and to say, aha, those people are working on biological weapons, right? So if you have that sort of nugget of truth to work from, it's much easier to sort of build a much more explosive kind of conclusion onto it. That tends to be what these Russian operations tend to do. A lot of this stuff is not designed to stand up to, to real serious scrutiny, but that doesn't matter, right? Because if I get it out there to enough people, 10 of you don't believe it, that doesn't matter. One of you does. And one of you transmits it to 10 other people, right? And so this becomes, this kind of viral replication, right? I don't have to get everybody. I have to get somebody who's going to then start to spiral it into social media. And this is the other thing. We're all aware about how social media operates, right? Once you read one story, you click on one thing, you're going to go down a rabbit hole of several other things that are more related. The algorithms will channel you in that direction. So if the initial disinformation can send you down that hole, you're going to be in a very different place psychologically or thinking about this particular issue than you were, 2 or 3 or 4 days before. All right. So as I said, the Soviet Union, before Russia, was doing this for years, right? Nothing new about this. So what's different today? And I think you have to ask yourself, what would you do if you wanted to produce an information operation in, say, the 1980s? Right? What are the tools that you had then compared to now? And as you start to do that, you realize the distinctions and the differences, right? So think about it. If it's, say, 1985, and I want to run a disinformation operation in, say, Germany. What was my example before? The neutron bomb. If I want to do that, well, how do people get information? TV, radio, newspapers. So I need to find journalists, either sympathetic journalists or, better yet, journalists that my intelligence services have compromised at some level, right? They have pictures of them in a hotel room doing things that, they don't want to get out. And I can use that to pressure them to take this story and run with it. But it's still got to get through that journalist's editor. It's still got to get through those filters and make it up into the general sort of news. So it's going to take a little time and effort, and I'm going to have to shade things very carefully. It's going to take time. It's going to be slow. It's not going to happen overnight. But today, right, I can go on a dozen different kinds of social media platforms. I can craft very cheaply, very targeted stories that seem very, very plausible. Using artificial intelligence today, I can craft things that sound like very real, credible people talking about something and put it out there. And it's very hard to disprove all that, right? Because even if you smack down one of them, another one's going to pop up. And my audience is huge and broad and very heavily distributed. So it puts us in a very sort of different environment and different information ecosystem, right? Where things are moving at a lot faster. And so if you cannot get on top of the disinformation quickly, it's very likely to find an audience and really start to change political ideas and opinions. And you have to understand that these disinformation campaigns are often aimed at distinct and multiple targets. And I'm talking about this primarily in a European context because that's where a huge amount of Russian effort has been. One of the ways that Russia has really used this is to try to target groups which are already angry about a particular situation and make them angrier so that potentially you get unrest and violence that forces the state to react. Right? This has been an ongoing goal. So let me give you an example. You may not be aware of this, but there was for a long time people living in Russia, have been there for generations, who were ethnically German, right? The Volga Germans. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, Germany gave them the right to come back to Germany and become German citizens, and many of them have done that, right, over time. But these people always kind of feel like second-class citizens. They came in obviously as, very poor sort of refugees. Yes, they're ethnically German, but they're from families that have lived in Russia for a very long time. And so, real Germans don't tend to see them as real Germans. They feel oftentimes discriminated against and kind of second class. So when in Russian media that these Russian Germans are still reading and looking at produces a story saying, hey, and they did this, a young teenage Russian German girl in Germany was sexually assaulted by, this gang of migrants that the German government let in. And look, the German government isn't doing anything about it. They don't care about you, right? That generates a lot of anger. That generates protest. And the German government's got to get out there and say, whoa, no. We don't think this actually happened, right? We think this has been grossly exaggerated, but it's too late, right? People already believe it. The same thing exactly in much of the Baltic states, whether it's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. There you have significant ethnic Russian populations living in those countries that are distinct and different from the Lithuanians and the Estonians and the Latvians. They don't speak the same language, right? And those Russians often feel sort of second-class citizens because they can't get the best jobs because they don't necessarily speak the local languages very well. And these stories that get into Russian media that those people pick up as ethnic Russians and say Latvia or whatever, reinforce their sense of difference and separation, and their closeness to Mother Russia. And all this is designed to sort of weaken civil society in those countries, right? Make it harder for them to operate normally. Another big thing, and we've seen this mostly in Western Europe and in the United States, information systems intrusions and these sort of information operation campaigns, which are really designed to force people to question the legitimacy of political outcomes, right? So I do not actually have to intrude on the electoral system and change votes, right? And that, by the way, is extremely difficult to do. But if I can launch thousands of attacks on county electoral rolls and things like that, and if I can get one or two places, someplace in Oregon or something where I've been managed to actually intrude in on the system, maybe nothing actually happens, nothing gets changed, but people's confidence in the system overall declines. And then when the person that they don't want gets elected, they have reason to question the legitimacy of the system. And that can be very damaging to democracies. So once again, it doesn't change things overnight. It's spraying water at a brick wall. Over time, it starts to corrode things. So this also puts the targeted governments in very awkward positions. So whether it's Germany responding in some ways or Lithuania or other countries, to do this sometimes, right, you get into positions where these governments have to censor what they see as obvious Russian disinformation. Some people are going to believe it, and some people are going to see that censorship as proof that it's true, right? So it becomes very difficult to deal with, and it tends to generate a lot of protests, particularly within these groups these minority groups that exist within European countries that already feel aggrieved about things. And finally, this is a great tool that Russia has used to drive wedges between allied states in Europe, right? They have used this to create divisions between Poland and Germany and the Baltic states and France. They find ways to use this to create those tensions that make it more difficult for those states to operate collectively, right, as the European Union or as NATO. Once again, all this is cheap, right? This costs you next to nothing to do. So you can keep doing it over and over and over again. It's very difficult to respond to. Yeah, and eventually it adds up to an effect. Let me just talk about what people are kind of doing about this, and we'll wrap it up. One of the things that is sort of this basic problem when you try to coordinate across states is that every state sees this as an internal security issue, right? This is our problem. This is a German problem. This is a Finnish problem, whatever. We'll deal with it. We don't want you messing around with us. So you tend to have less cooperation because all of these states tend to guard information very closely about any potential weakness. You don't want that being shared too much. That said, enough states across Europe and the United States have come to the conclusion that we're all vulnerable at some level and we're all being targeted at some level. And so some level of cooperation is absolutely necessary. And so what you've got is this kind of emerging mix of different ways of coping with this. Some are purely regional, right? So based on existing historic ties, the states around like Finland, Sweden, Estonia, these are places that are very sophisticated on information technology, and they're used to cooperating a lot, right? They have a lot of good social connections between their governments. So there's really good regional cooperation in places like that. The European Union and NATO have both been trying to deal with this as organizations. They've been doing things that I think are pretty complementary in some ways. So NATO itself has put together this Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, which, as you might expect for a political military organization, has a lot of military people working within it. And they are primarily focused on government information systems and disinformation campaigns being produced by other countries, particularly Russia. So they're doing an enormous amount of training and sort of forward-looking threat analysis and helping to sort of coordinate responses across Europe and the United States. At a very different level, the European Union's Agency for Cybersecurity, as you might expect from the EU, which is, from its core focused on economics and economic growth and development, is very much focused on the stability of the digital economy. Making sure, for example, that there's never that questioning of the banking system, right? Making sure that no one can intrude and disrupt payment systems. And so they've gotten very good at that. And so in some ways, these things they're different, but really very complementary. That said, the European Union is making an effort to be a security actor in and of its own way, right? Distinct and separate from NATO. And they put together a cybersecurity strategy, which I thought was kind of interesting. And I'm quoting from it here because part of it talks about developing an operational capacity to prevent, deter, and respond. Why do I find that interesting? Well, prevent is obviously a defensive operation. But deter, how do I deter you from doing something? I have a weapon that's going to cause you unacceptable damage. Therefore, you don't want to touch me. And respond implies that I'm actually going to use that if I have to. So they're talking about developing sort of offensive tools of cybersecurity, right? Which is sort of the flip side of all the defensive work that everybody's doing now. So I think that's kind of an interesting place that we're ending up. All right, just to sort of end up with a couple of big questions that I think I've sort of tapped on, but may give you some things to think about or talk about. Big problem, always, who do you blame? Right? States can often engineer some level of plausible deniability. It wasn't me, it was that criminal network that happens to be based in one of our cities, and we're going to go off and try to arrest them. Oops, they got away, I'm sorry. But even if they don't, even if you can pin them down and say, yes, you are responsible, right? What do? What's the appropriate response, right? To use a military phrase, are kinetic responses appropriate, right? Should you use a physical attack in response to a cyber attack? When, right? Do you respond the same way? Well, how, right? Does this become sort of a tit for tat thing? You know, oh, you attacked our power grid in some place, so we're going to attack your power grid in another place. Where does that end, right? So should we be focusing primarily on defense, or should we really be developing better offensive tools and make this almost an alternative in some ways to, you know, more direct armed conflict? And if we do that, are we going to see more of an arms race, right? As everybody tries to get a level up. So those are really big open questions that I think people studying this field have. I don't have answers to them, right? Nobody really does. There's a big, long, lengthy debate about this. So if you have any ideas or thoughts, you're welcome to put them up there. So with that, I think I'll stop. Any questions or thoughts or comments you have, I'm happy to deal with. Yeah, back.
I have a question.
Sure.
What are the possible threats that this new boom, or like that boom sort of AI technology poses on cybersecurity?
Yeah, that is a huge one. I'm actually trying to publish something right now that deals with that at some level. So artificial intelligence gives you a number of different capabilities that you didn't have easily before. So one that's obvious for information operations is deepfake. Right? You can create videos now that look so real of someone saying things that they didn't say, right? Or doing things they didn't do, right? And once I put that out there, sure, you can deny it. And everybody can say, no, see, this is obviously a fake. No, it didn't really happen. But it's out there, right? And I forget who's, is it Mark Twain who said, you know, a lie will get halfway around the world before the truth gets its shoes on. I mean, in this kind of information environment, that's very true, right? And once again, I don't have to make everybody believe it. If I get 10 million people to see it and only 10% of them give it credibility, I've won, right? So that is a huge difference, I think, right there with AI. In a more sort of general sense, what we're seeing now are AI-enabled systems in militaries, and there's obviously very powerful ethical considerations about preventing the use of AI-enabled systems to fire upon people or combatants. But the line there is getting thinner and thinner, right? Everybody's using more and more of this, and it's going to be a really interesting question to see where that goes. So yeah, I think the AI issue and the way that it is growing so quickly is going to be the biggest thing to watch. So yeah, I think there's critical thoughts.
I have a question. Yes. I was thinking psychology must play a big role in this whole thing.
Yeah.
Is there any specific thing
Yeah, yeah. The psychology of all this is really fascinating. So if you talk to anybody who's actually involved in, social media programming or anything like that, I mean, they understand the simplicity. Right? They understand the psychology, the need that people give for validation from other people responding to their posts and stuff like that. And what we've seen with the growth of social media is that a very distinct kind of information environment from what existed previously. So, it's a time in history, 1990, right? There's no internet. You get a physical newspaper, you pick it up, you open it, you read a story, you go on to the next story, you go on to another one. What happens today? Pick up your tablet, you tap on a story that seems interesting in whatever social media feed you're looking at, you read that, that's automatically going to drive you to several others that are more like that. So as opposed to you picking up a physical newspaper and reading different things, right? What you're going to be doing now is going further and further down a particular hole, a channel, right? That's distinct and separate from other things. So you're going to be, if someone is running a disinformation campaign and you read that, you're going to be directed to more things that validate that and make that more true to you, right? And the more true you make something to people, the more difficult it is to change their mind later on, right? So people have in psychological terms, confirmation bias, right? We give more weight to information that validates our pre-existing ideas, and we tend to discount information that goes against that. So the more that I read about a particular thing, right, that puts me down a certain track, it's going to be much more difficult to shift me away from it. Right? So once again, I don't have to get 10 million people viewing something to all go down that road. I just need to get 10% of it, right? And that starts to change things. So, yeah, the psychology of this is fascinating, right? The interchange between technology and psychology is really, I think, that human-computer interaction is fascinating.
We saw so many pictures of espionage
Sure.
during the Second World War,
Right.
whatever. How big is that thing today?
How big is
The espionage. How big is? I mean, Chinese, Russian.
Yeah,
I mean, they're doing cyber espionage, but is there still the individuals that?
Sure, of course, right? The good old-fashioned espionage, right? I find an individual, I exploit that individual's weaknesses to get information out of them. Of course, everybody does that, right? Because those individuals can provide very high-quality information at particular times. This is more like trying to run everything through a huge filter, right? So you're doing sort of quantity over quality. And as you filter through that, and artificial intelligence can filter things very effectively, right? I'm able to then pick up the particular things that might be very useful for me. So, for example, with the Office of Personnel Management Act, you get the files of, I don't know, 10,000, 100,000 people who have high-level security clearances or have had those clearances. They're not all going to be useful to me, but wait a minute. Here's a guy who's got a top secret clearance, who works in this lab, who has a wife, who has a cousin that lives in Shanghai. Oh, gee, wouldn't it be a shame if that cousin couldn't seem to go to college and couldn't get a job and then maybe if we could communicate that back, through that family that, well, things could be a lot easier for, maybe you're a little more cooperative. We don't want you to spy for us. It's all in the interest of peace and communication and scientific exchange. Would you come to our campus for a scientific exchange and perhaps bring some of these materials to talk about? It would all be done very subtly, right? Very, very few times are people lured into these kinds of things by saying, either you're now a spy for our government, right? It always starts casually, slowly. Yeah, I know someone who not completely was partially sucked into one of these kinds of situations by Russian intelligence. It started off with very casually with things like, you know, just going out to lunch with somebody and then saying, oh God, you're working on such interesting stuff. I'd love to know more about that. And, you know, would you be willing to maybe write about this for our specialized journal? And, you know, it was all a Russian government operation to get information out of this person and lure them down a path, sort of at a point at which they would be revealing things that are secret, but never starting there, right? So, yeah, this is a tool.
I was thinking of all those secrets that were stolen, you know,
Yeah.
when you were talking about the clearance.
Yeah.
All these guys had clearance and were able to steal all these secrets that were later on made public, you know.
Yeah, I mean, this goes on all the time. And I guess what I'm trying to emphasize, this is a tool. This is a series of tools that states are using, but they start to raise some very fundamental questions about how we move forward. And by the way, the United States is not, you know, it's no innocent to this, right? I mean, it plays this game as well, right? There are no clean hands in this, right? So don't think that.
One of the problems that this thing has is that most people don't believe it, that the U.S. and the other governments are doing it right now, you know. All this going on.
I mean, in a Machiavellian sense, why wouldn't you, right? I mean, why would you let a huge advantage just sit on the table when you can take advantage of it?
And another question.
Yeah.
How powerful, how good are the Chinese and the Russians in their systems with their cyberspace systems? Are equivalent to the U.S.?
You're getting into areas of I mean, I focus on sort of the politics of this, the actual technology and the technical aspects. I'm much weaker on. My sense is that you have very well developed capacities in all of these places, but in somewhat different ways. And I think where China has focused is its ability to target weaknesses in American civilian and military systems, so that if a war comes, that they can rapidly cause damage to those systems and make it very difficult for the United States to respond. Russia's been much more focused on, like I said, I think information operations, right? The psychology of all of this. So I think that's kind of the distinction I would make. Yeah, I mean, but it varies. Sorry.
What role are colleges and universities playing in all of this? Like, are they receiving, are the psychology and tech departments, like, are they receiving funding from the state governments? Like, what role are we playing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's sort of different pots of money for this, depending on who you're talking to. Obviously, the Department of Defense has been big in this, the National Security Agency. So, you know, National Security Agency does an awful lot of this, both defensively and both in terms of scooping up huge shots of information. They've been very aggressive trying to recruit people from science departments, engineering departments. Less so the psychology aspects of this, but I'm sure they bring in some of that. There's actually a big drive in sort of developing artificial intelligence, not necessarily always related to this, but some of those big questions. So actually, my university, UF, has a big cross or interdisciplinary AI focus. So people from psychology, computer engineering, physics, because we actually have a physics lab that works on computers, quantum computing, and some other things like that. So it's, yeah, there's a lot out there. If you're interested in it, there's a lot of opportunities for students. All right. Nothing else, thank you very much. It's been great talking to you all.
Thank you
Thank you.
very much.
No. Thank you for coming.
Where are you staying?
I'm staying in it's like a guest house in Old Sound.
Oh, okay.
And, it's very touristy, but I feel like it's really
I'm sorry, like I said yesterday, I couldn't come, but, always fascinating. These whole things.
Yeah,